what you need. Supernatural feel. It's not what you feel. You can see in thoughts. Is it really yours? Come and hold me now. I can make you feel.
Yes.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be presenting on balancing techniques, primarily based on the law of one. I found the law of one about, 10 years ago now. And it's really what kind of jump-started my spiritual journey. And one important thing that I found in my journey was kind of learning ways to balance oneself, right? So in terms of questions, let's try to have most of the questions at the end. I don't mind if maybe everyone limits themselves to maybe one question or comment while we're doing this, just in the interest of time.
Okay.
So I'm
You have to
sure most of
save
you
it up to make it a good one.
you just used yours, so, but that was pretty funny. So I think it's a good.
Don't jump on the first question you have then.
So I'm sure we all heard this Zen Buddhist kind of I don't know if it's a koan, but it's a saying, right? Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And we have a little meme here. Sometimes I definitely feel like on the path, all you really gain, at least initially, is a kind of an awareness, right? An awareness of your addictions and habit patterns are just the first step. And that's where I think a lot of these techniques come in, is once you're aware, how do we kind of perhaps get past that stage? In terms of kind of what we're going to be going over today, disclaimers, as there always are, important disclaimers to be said. Kind of the reference material, the background material, that's kind of important to understand if you're going to be, I guess, understanding a lot of what we're going to be talking about. Then some working theories, then the actual balancing techniques, and some parting thoughts. So please disregard everything and anything in this presentation that doesn't resonate. Many Confederation sources talk about this. Here's a quote from Quo. I think it's important for many reasons. I'll get into the idea that we're talking about spiritual concepts that are difficult to explain through the language of the mind. Also, I personally believe that there's no 100% accurate source of information. There's always going to be some sort of, distortion involved. So please take what you find valuable and leave the rest. In terms of language, these are kind of, as I said, spiritual concepts. So they're very difficult for the mind to explain and discuss in terms of language. So when I say a given word or phrase, it might be useful, and I found this useful when I read other people's words and phrases, to kind of explore adjacent concepts. So if I say something like a light-colored car, maybe, and that doesn't really work for you, you can't figure it out, maybe start thinking in terms of a light-colored plane, a dark-colored train, a light-colored ship, things of that nature. For those of you who are into philosophy, you might recognize this image on the right as kind of an image of a rendering of Plato's allegory of the caves. So I'm going to explain a little bit differently than Plato, just to make it clear as to maybe the barriers that discussing these concepts have spiritually. So the guy in the back would be like spirit, right? So spirit can actually see the bird, and presumably he's very close to the light. So they kind of, spirit understands these concepts, but kind of describing these concepts through the language of the mind is like the guy looking at the shadow. He's only going to get a certain aspect of it. And it's very important to understand that a lot of these concepts and balancing techniques, it's important to try out on your own, because you can't fully understand them through language alone, or this PowerPoint, or the visuals here. Once again, these balancing techniques are not comprehensive. They might not work for you. The journey's individual. Everyone's different. I think some of the latter techniques, I don't know, I use the phrase advanced. I don't know if those are the best terminology for advanced techniques, but they do seem to require certain prerequisites to use effectively, at least in my journey. And as I said, it's not a comprehensive list. Just a moment. I totally forgot to start the timer here, so I can manage my own time. All right. So this is one thing I've found difficult, and I think we had a whole podcast on how do you genuinely serve others. But sometimes, I think it's important to accept others' free will to struggle with their lessons. And, it might be, sometimes I just see a situation of a friend or a close friend. Usually they're not spiritual, but they're struggling with something. You can recognize the pattern in their catalyst, and you just want to give them unsolicited advice, right? But obviously that's not very helpful. I think it's very important to respect other people's free will decisions to make suboptimal decisions, so to speak. Everyone's on their own journey, and they're going at their own pace. But I have definitely found it difficult when I'm like, I just want to tell them, here's the pattern, and like maybe try looking it through these lenses and try to figure it out. But and to be honest, I probably have done that once or twice, but it usually is not very helpful at all, So I'm sorry for this very long quote. But I think it's very important to have a daily practice. And the Law of One, and specifically Ra, talks about useful exercises. And, just to paraphrase this, you can read this on your own because you guys all have the PowerPoint. Is, exercise 1, the moment contains love. Exercise 2, the universe is one being. So when you look at another mind, body, spirit complex, see the creator. Exercise 3, when you look at yourself, see the creator. And exercise 4, when you're looking at basically things other than mind, body, spirit, so all of physical reality, see that as the creator. And then it goes on to say, it doesn't term it as an exercise, but the last part is very, very important. So the foundation for these exercises is a predilection towards what can maybe called meditation, contemplation, or prayer. With this attitude, these exercises can be processed. Without it, the data will not sink into the roots of the tree of the mind, thus enabling and ennobling the body and touching the spirit. And there's a link for you to look into it further. Ra talks about this in books 1 through 4. Basically, energy centers. Hindu, I guess, mysticism talks about the chakras. And I just posted an image. I think it's useful to look at Ra's kind of explanation of the energy centers. It's useful to look at, Hindu explanations. And there's more than just like Buddhism also talks about a lot of different mystical practices talk about it, and just kind of see what concepts they're talking about, and also personally explore those concepts. It's almost like a little bit of a cheat sheet, but as we'll talk about later, having a cheat sheet on a test or a quiz where you have to show your work is only one small part of the equation. And showing your work for balancing distortions is very important. And I'll get into what I mean by that. But often you might recognize, just briefly, okay, I don't love myself, or I don't love my body, whatever, orange ray, right? Oh, clearly the answer is to just unconditionally love myself, right? And unconditionally love my body. But that doesn't get you to the goal. You actually have to often visit those intermediate distortions, that are there in everyone that block that realization, so to speak. This is a little bit more.
Are you going to give us an account of the significance of the energy centers?
Yeah, I can go over it briefly.
That would justify the introduction of them in the first place, I think, and it would give context to what you're doing here.
Right. So this presentation was more planned for people with a kind of understanding of this, but just a short version would be kind of the idea that energy kind of flows through us, and it's basically on this diagram here, from the root chakra all the way up through the crown. And generally speaking, the root chakra, which is called the red ray, by the way. So you can look at the colors to correspond with how the Ra material talks about this. And each one of these kind of energy centers contains beliefs or distortions about a certain form of love, or love versus fear with respect to reality. So red ray or root chakra is about survival fears, surviving in daily life. And if you think about it, usually if you have a lot of fears about survival in life, it's difficult for the energy to move to the second level. Now, this might sound all theoretical, but if you actually think about how people in life are sometimes stuck in these areas, it becomes, to me, very clear. So then the next level for the energy to go to is basically the orange ray, which is kind of like how you view yourself, your emotions, one-on-one interactions, right? So typically, people who are just really, really worried about, making ends meet and just surviving and working two jobs and just making enough money to have, I guess, shelter and food. It's going to be difficult for them perhaps to really worry about the self because they're just so stuck in those survival fears, right? Or another example would be like if there's a threat of war, something of that nature, it's considered much more, the survival fears are considered much more important. Then
Is a romantic relationship rooted in Orange Ray?
I think sexual and romantic relationships, they touch upon many rays, but once again, it's you very commonly see you can get stuck in one ray. So just like basic reproduction, maybe a very primal form of lust would be red ray. Then with orange ray, it's a little bit more about the enjoyment of yourself as a sexual being interacting with someone else, maybe perhaps an emotional connection. Ra also talks about specifically that a distortion of the orange ray sexuality is seeing yourself as an object or the other person as an object. It's that interaction between you and another self. So it can kind of go up, right? So truth be told, yellow ray I find often the hardest to put into words, but it's basically, I think, the way you, it's a sense of your interaction with other selves at a societal level, and also in terms of maybe at least the distortions of social hierarchy. Ra talks specifically about being the best way to balance that is to love all who are in relationship with you. So really, it's about social relationships. I think of it in terms of roles or social roles almost. And of course, green ray, unconditional universal love. Certainly, we'd hope most romantic relationships get there. Ra definitely talks about the idea of sacred sexuality is really enabled by at least making it to the green ray for both parties involved. And then the blue ray, communication, indigo ray, faith, and I think wisdom is actually, I always get mixed up, but I think wisdom, I think both blue and indigo. And certain types of wisdom are present in all the rays. In terms of the crown chakra, that's kind of like the direct connection to the creator. And honestly, I haven't studied that too much, so maybe someone else can chime in as to a description. And if you're, I guess, watching this and you're new to the law of one material, specifically Ra talks about the idea in third density. A big reason why we're here is to make the choice, which is basically at least opening the green ray. I think they say, at least on Earth, 51% for whatever percentage, to make the positive polarity harvest, so to speak. And it goes in more depth about negative harvests and being in, the area of indifference, so to speak. So, yeah, it's I consider this a feedback mechanism, as to kind of see a kind of a helpful way of seeing where your distortions are and maybe where the ideal form of it is, and then of course the work is getting between point A and point B.
I think you've got a lot of mileage out of articulating those distinctions. That's always a useful touchstone for making points, I think, the chakra system.
Absolutely. So with respect to the next slide, I just put it on here. I'm not going to discuss this too much, maybe in a follow-up presentation, but a lot of the balancing techniques will often kind of turn on a combination of some of these archetypes, especially the mind archetypes. Well, frankly, they could turn on a lot of archetypes. I personally have studied the mind archetypes the most. So it may come up in conversation, but it's probably something that's more involved, just because the archetypes are pretty esoteric if you haven't already done your own kind of work with respect to them. And briefly, so Ra talked about the archetypes as kind of a template given by this solar system, so to speak, as to how, I guess, spiritual lessons are learned in a certain sense, and kind of a progression of how those things are handled. Okay, so this I termed working theory, subjective effectiveness versus objective reality. And what I mean by that is that some of these frameworks and techniques are just designed for effectiveness and don't necessarily correspond with a 100% accurate version of reality. And the picture I have here, if you don't recognize these individuals, Einstein and Newton, right? So theory of gravity, Newton's theory doesn't really cover special relativity and doesn't, Newton's theory doesn't really work for very extreme cases of gravity, black holes and stuff like that. But in general, on Earth, we don't use Einstein's theory. We don't need all the special accurate versions of reality. We just have like a general formula that works, and that's Newton. So that's kind of what the goal for these techniques kind of is just have something that works. It doesn't, I'm not necessarily attached to the idea that any given balancing technique is an accurate depiction of how things work at the highest level, if that makes sense. Okay, so this is a working theory that I found useful for myself. So I'm going to just describe it, kind of categorizing the origins of emotions. And the reason I say this is that, at least in my journey, I've found that there is some level of catalyst that comes from the animal brain, and that type of catalyst is subject to different sorts of balancing techniques, in the sense that because it is part of your animal brain, it's difficult to get rid of it completely because it's just always going to be there. So the example I would say is, if you're in a car and you're about to get in a car accident and you avoid it at the last minute, you might not even think anything, but your heart just starts pounding, right? There's certain things that happen, certain things that affect you and your senses, right? And Ra talks about catalysts as affecting your senses. Basically, all that assaults your senses is catalysts that just come, I would say, from not necessarily from any distortion, but just the fact that we are part animals. We have a 2D, in a certain sense, a 2D body. I would also say, interestingly, that I think modern society understands the animal portion of the brain. And when I say the animal portion of the brain, it's important to also understand that the best way to view this is to not necessarily identify fully with it. Certainly, it's a part of you, right? If your heart's beating fast after you barely avoid an accident, a part of you was afraid of dying. A part of you was in fear, right? But to understand that part of you is not does not represent all of you, right? It's not 100% accurate. And the interesting thing that I find is that I think modern society actually understands this very well when it comes to sexuality, right? So as a guy, like, you might be in a relationship, but you might see a very beautiful woman and you might think some thoughts about certain activities with that woman almost automatically, but it's understood you're not going to act on them, right? A part of you clearly is attracted to her, but that's a part of your animal brain. Now, this example might not be the best example, because certainly if you have a lot of distortions towards sexuality, some of those thoughts could be from those distortions, right? But I think there is a primal aspect of attraction, and then people understand just because you find someone attractive and have a certain thought doesn't mean you're going to act on it, right? It's that understanding that it's only a part of who you are. And the reason I mention this is that I feel that there's a part of the animal brain that gets a little upset when you're socially disrespected, just a little bit. Now, certainly, I think a lot of social disrespect comes from, like, where you get upset, comes from yellow ray and orange ray distortions. But in my explorations, there is a slight amount that just comes from, two wolves interacting, so to speak, right? Where there's just that maybe primal aspect of, at least for guys, masculinity involved that maybe is always going to be a little bit there. And so once again, don't necessarily identify with it. Just understand it's a part of the animal brain. At least that's been useful in my journey. Now, you're also going to find that there's going to be strong feelings and emotions that come from personal distortions, societal distortions, that either you have personally adopted, or if you're interested in healing societal distortions, I find that they can be catalytic for you. And then also, typically, if you have even a small level of personal distortion, if someone else has a greater level of that exact same distortion, there's kind of a mirroring effect where if they get upset, you can actually kind of feel it if you share a little bit of their distortion. And for that, I think a lot more balance techniques are available. And that's why I kind of put opportunity for healing. And my phone shut off here. So let's see how we're time. All right. Once again, working theory here on fears, insecurities, concerns, and expectations as common distortions. I think it's difficult at first to distinguish these as distortions because often these fears, insecurities, concerns, and expectations will be upheld by society, by logic, by normalcy, by effectiveness. They're very if you're not in terror of this deadline, you're not going to get the work done, right? And so the terror and fear is very effective in motivating you to work. So at first, they're kind of hard to kind of get rid of because they make sense. But once you start to build some momentum from moving from fear-based motivation to love-based motivation, you'll start to see more and more of these in your life. It's kind of a momentum. I would say that most of these, the ideal version is that they're dissolved with one exception. Expectations can actually go from a strong expectation to a slight preference. And I think it's okay to have preferences. Like I might prefer to have strawberry over chocolate. And if I order a strawberry dessert, I'm not going to lose my shit if they say, oh, I'm sorry, we only have chocolate and serve it to me, right? Whereas if you expect the strawberry, you might lose your shit. So I think that slight preferences are consistent with some sort of balance. You'll notice that dissolving all of these will naturally quiet the mind. Don't try to expect to remove all of them at once. It's a long process. And here's a quote from Ra that I thought was useful, where basically you're talking about how common techniques of enslavement are in our social structures. And then Ra goes on to say, at this present space-time, the condition of well-meant and unintentional slavery are so numerous that it beggars our ability to enumerate them. And at least for me, this quote speaks to kind of how much we're raised in society with fears, insecurities, concerns, and expectations is just like normal and even healthy to a certain extent. All right, so now we're actually getting to the meat of this presentation, the balancing toolbox, so to speak. So I try to sort these in a rough order of importance. So the first one I would say is kind of like developing or cultivating inner observation without identification or logic. You know, allowing yourself to feel, think, and perceive the moment, or a catalytic memory without judgment. And honestly, in this process, allowing yourself to hold contradictory or logical thoughts, feelings, perceptions without judgments or strong personal identification. Maybe this is a poor example, but as if you're watching a television within your mind. And the meme I posted here, it's a little bit cut off, but it says basically, if the voice in your head is you, who's listening to it, right? And it's kind of building up this notion that, you know, whatever thoughts going through your head is only a part of you, right? And it's not the full expansive version of you. And an important way to develop this is meditation. I broadly just put 4 categories of meditation that I've found useful to think of, but meditation's like exercise. You can do it in countless ways with different goals and different results. What I term observation meditation is very useful for learning to observe your own thoughts, emotions, perceptions. I know a lot of people who are new to meditation often say, oh, I can't silence the mind. Well, you know, with observation meditation, you're not trying to silence the mind. You're trying to observe the mind, right? Breath meditations, focusing on one breaths. You know, there's entire systems of Hindu mystical enlightenment that revolve around breath meditation, Kriya Yoga. It's very powerful. And let me just put a caveat here. With respect to meditation, I haven't really formally tried out many systems like Kriya Yoga. I haven't really tried out, you know, I haven't really, maybe I tried out like one session with someone. But most of these things I've just discovered through, you know, just basically experimentation and maybe just reading something online. But I wasn't really following any systems. But I've found in my experimentation, breath meditation is very powerful. It's yeah, I don't know. It's just like you can, at least for me, I feel like I can really sense and maybe move around energy. But it's almost like you're breathing on a fire, you know, and the fire is the energy in a chakra. And if you use breath and focus on a particular chakra, you can at least temporarily really increase the energy moving through it. I would say energy meditation is kind of related to this, but it's basically just learning to observe and then focus or move energy within your body. Breath is one way, but it's not the only way to move energy around within your body. Prayer meditation, I just put on here because I've done it before, and it's just a way of asking for assistance. We'll talk about it more. There's a whole slide dedicated to this. But I've found that prayer is more effective if the request is for internal alchemy as opposed to like, hey, I want a brand new car or whatever, like something external, right? And I think the whole point, and you hear this a lot from many different practices is the point of meditation is to use these meditative techniques in waking life, right? It's very effective. So I term it here daily observation of comfortable and discomfortable catalysts, because there's a later quote later on where Ra actually talks about catalysts as both comfortable and discomfortable. So even though we often think of catalysts as something that I guess is uncomfortable and seems to hurt us or whatever, or be painful, there is positive. There is, I don't want to use the word positive because it's a different term. There is enjoyable catalysts that that can motivate us to change as well. So whenever you're working with a distortion, especially if there's a pattern of a given distortion within your life, I've noticed that if you do the daily practice and every day you kind of look over how your day went, often the uncomfortable catalyst will come to the forefront. But at least for me, on rare occasion, it is rare, I'll notice, hey, there's a very a very comfortable, pleasurable catalyst. I'll talk about some specifically when it comes to the breaking down of the personal veil and faith. But sometimes you can have very positive, I don't want to use the word positive, you have very comfortable catalyst. And you can think about, well, what created that catalyst, or what was I thinking or feeling or perceiving at the time? Probably a more concrete example would be the idea of you had a deadline, and at least the old me would be like, oh man, we got to get super worried and super stressed out, and that's how we're going to get it done. And literally like adrenaline will be pumping and I'll be sweating by the time I finish it. It's horrible, right? For your entire system. But moving to a place where you're just doing it in a relaxed manner, even with that deadline. And sometimes even noticing, wow, I'm really just enjoying like being in the flow of the moment, right? And kind of examining, well, what was the difference between the day I was stressed out about work and doing it at the last minute, and what was the difference between the day where I was not stressed out but still doing it at the last minute with some sense of enjoyment? And sometimes kind of delving deep even into the positive, I'm horrible about this, into the comfortable catalyst can really yield benefits in understanding what created it, and so that you can apply more of that in your life. So acceptance is a big one for the Law of One. Acceptance comes from a lot of different energy centers, but I think a big one comes from the Green Ray. So one version of acceptance is acceptance through understanding, like understanding all the causal factors, statistics, reasoning, any intent behind something internally or externally that has happened, I think makes acceptance much more easily. Sometimes you have to combine it with other techniques. And one thing that is very important is, I think everyone learns this maybe the hard way, and definitely Ra talks about this, that not all things can be understood, especially in third density. And Ra says it's absolutely necessary that an entity consciously realize it does not understand in order for it to be harvestable. Understanding is not of this density. Acceptance through forgiveness. Forgiveness is very powerful. I think when I realized it was powerful was when I started to apply it for situations that didn't make sense. It seems, at least to me, obvious if you're upset with someone or some other entity, forgiveness is an important factor. But I don't know how it came about, but maybe a few years ago, I started to try to apply the concept of forgiveness to seemingly illogical situations with inanimate objects. And it really moved my energy around and really helped springboard me into acceptance. I don't know if I had the actual example of a car breaking down, but I remember it was something stupid that I was really upset about. I think it was like a printer malfunction or something, and it was making my day a pain because I had to rush and go to like Kinko's and print stuff out. And I was just really upset. And it was almost like just forgiving the printer released some energy. And maybe at a certain level, I saw the printer as the creator screwing me over or something, and I was forgiving the creator. But I didn't think that consciously. But it actually really, even though it makes no sense to forgive something inanimate, it really did help me. And after that, I started to apply forgiveness in any situation where you feel something's unfair or something's wrong, even if the cause is not something with that self-awareness, it really does work. And I don't really know why, but I just thought I'd mention here. So acceptance through faith, of course, please don't take this slide as to a definition of what faith is. I think Jeremy and I, we're probably going to have an entire podcast on this one, right? What is faith? But, just for the purposes of this balancing technique, I would term it as maybe confidence in the creator, that the creator has your back in some way. Um, in my journey, faith definitely does not involve confidence in a specific external outcome. So, for example, having faith that the creator would never let you lose your home if you can't make your mortgage payment, versus having faith that the creator will provide for your shelter needs, right? So the latter would be what I would consider faith, whereas the former I would not consider it faith. Maybe it's some other concept, but I don't feel it's a faith. It would be faith.
Is faith even a transitive concept in the first place?
I honestly, I would lean towards no, but I really don't know. It's something.
You can have faith, pure and simple, without it being faith in something, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I do find that it's a muscle. Like the more you build your faith, it grows. And I'll talk about this later, but I think it's really important to not suppress any contradictory feelings. With respect to faith, I think it's very important to also give yourself space to have doubt. And because I think naturally on the journey, the doubt will end up going down. But I think doubt is an important part of discernment. And so you should never like artificially force yourself to suppress doubt. I think you can live in faith while holding doubt simultaneously.
I think that's a very, very good point.
So, all right. Acceptance of bad events. So this is just giving space in your life mentally for bad events to exist and occur. So for me, I kind of honestly look at it statistically a lot of times. For example, when I was training new attorneys or mentoring them, I would tell them that even the best attorneys get yelled at clients, even 30 years into the practice. It's just a part of the experience of being an attorney. Now, certainly you want to learn from the experience, and, with skill, expertise, and, everything else, you're going to decrease the frequency of it. But really, it's still going to happen on occasion, right? And you look, and you can replace attorneys being yelled at by clients with literally almost anything bad. And it's just a part of the experience of being human, that bad stuff happens. I do think you can decrease their frequency, but never completely remove them, at least on a 3D mixed polarity planet. I often talk about, another thing I'd often talk about with, when I was in management with some of my direct reports is be like, hey, it's understandable eventually if someone at work yells at you, like a coworker, hopefully, you'll learn from it, what you can, and decrease the frequency. But workplace disagreements, it doesn't necessarily indicate that something's going terribly wrong. It's just a fact of life that sometimes people lash out at each other, whether it's justified completely, partially, or not at all, And I think if you're willing to accept that, it takes the edge off those sorts of catalysts, right? So one thing that has definitely helped me is acceptance of fears through planning. This is once again, it's a way of taking the edge off catalyst. So fully envisioning the materialization of a fear in meditation, feeling all the emotions, thoughts, and perceptions as a result, and then saying, okay, well then what would I do in order to still find a little happiness, or, not be completely in a panic mode. So I'm trying to think of the example or the first time I used this, and I'm not sure when I did, but maybe an example that makes sense is, back when I was unemployed and unemployed makes it sound like there's a large gap. I was applying for jobs after school, right? So it's not like a real period of unemployment, but, I guess it was a very fearful time. This is many years ago. And I was like, man, what if I have to I can't afford to pay rent and stuff like that. And then I just, I came up with plan B, C, D, E, and F. Well, okay, well, worst case, it would kind of suck to be homeless, live in a shelter, but, I do love reading. So I probably just get a shit ton of books and just read a lot, right? That's not terrible. And just coming up with things of okay, it would suck for sure. And I'd be like, you know what? I'm friends with some homeless people because, I used to be a public defender, and I used to see some repeats. And I also always giving money to the local homeless. So actually I've started some friendships. I'm like, yeah, actually there's some cool people on the streets. I'd probably have a friendship or two, someone to chill with. It still doesn't remove the fear totally, but it softened the edge, right? And in a certain sense, you're kind of examining it by both the logic and emotional parts of your brain, and just softening the edge of that catalyst. So this method I termed as an advanced technique. So the acceptance of fear through the gauntlet method. It's just a term I created. I don't recommend this for people who have PTSD or panic attacks. So this is a kind of form where it's similar to the last one, but you're letting yourself not be comforted. Basically, you're envisioning your fears coming true and contemplating the idea that you have no power to change it or execute any backup plans, although that's often untrue. Just to bring out the most pure form of that fear. It's almost like allowing yourself to feel hopeless, right? But once again, you don't identify with that hopelessness. You just want to kind of move the energy around and explore these fears. And so when done correctly, it can springboard to acceptance, or even past simple acceptance into complete surrender. And I'll talk about that technique at the end. But basically, what I'm going to talk about is complete surrender later on. Is kind of it's like feeling the catalyst, feeling the fear, feeling the despair, and then feeling the compassion for your despair all at once, and completely surrendering the experience to the creator. And it seems to go into Indigo Ray. So this is kind of adopting responsibility for all catalysts caused by the self. So it's actually very compatible with Stoicism. And when I've described this randomly about like this concept to people who are not necessarily spiritual, they're like, "Oh, you're a Stoic." And I actually was in undergrad. I was a philosophy major, well, a double major, philosophy and computer science. And then I was like, yeah, that actually does vaguely sound familiar, because I haven't read it in like 20 years. And then I looked it up, and actually is consistent with at least some Stoic ideas. So the idea that anything that bothers you is because of unresolved distortions within you. All is one, and everything's a mirror. Of course, don't use this to be mean to someone. If someone else is in pain, don't be like, "Oh, it's all internal. Like, I don't give a shit about what you have to say." It's still important to listen to them, to be compassionate, and if they feel that you played a part in their misery, like, don't just ignore that, right? This is a quote where I was talking about, where they talk about catalyst through comfort or discomfort. And the idea that everything that assaults your senses, this is not the quote with that, but basically everything is catalyst. Oh yeah, all that assaults your senses is catalyst. Ra talks about this, acknowledging opposites in the moment and in contemplation. It can help put either comfortable or discomfortable emotions into perspective. It can help one better understand the polarity involved in many concepts. I don't know why, but I feel like in this day and age, people have not yet realized that failure is an inherent part of success. It's very uncommon. It's, in my opinion, very rare to have success without having some early failures. But a lot of people, they seem to get discouraged without understanding almost the polarity linkage between the two, right? And in general, I think we all know this. How can you have one concept without having another, right? So embarrassment and social esteem, or being well regarded by your peers. And there's many examples of this, right? So maybe on a less esoteric or spiritual example is tall and short, right? If people are all the same height, you wouldn't have tall and short. Those concepts wouldn't exist. So in a certain sense, for there to be success, there has to be failure, right? It's just the nature of those concepts. This is almost interrelated to the idea of giving yourself space for bad events, with the idea that, when you have the polarity that you don't like, embarrassment, failure, understanding it's just one aspect of the spectrum, and it's just a part of how this reality works whenever you're working with those concepts, right? So observing love in the moment while also respecting third density catalyst. So this is just my personal take on it. I think everyone is going to have a different version, perhaps, of how they experience love in the moment. But at least for me, after a certain level of work and consistent meditation, I had an experience where I strongly felt the love of the one infinite creator in what I would term a pure form. And nowadays, I experience it outside of meditation. But I would describe it as a full body, continuous, orgasmic electricity. And it's like, once you've tasted that energy, you'll always it like it almost like opens up a new sense perception within yourself, where you'll notice it was always there in the background. That energy was always there in the background at a very low level outside of meditation, just in everyday life. And it's almost like just being able to take a breath when you're experiencing catalyst, or not experiencing catalyst, just having a nice day, to take a deep breath and tap into observation of that energy that just is all around us, and it just is flowing through everywhere, while still observing and respecting and not suppressing whatever catalytic emotion, feeling, or thoughts you're having in the moment. And I'm sure there's many other ways to describe love in the moment, but I just find it something that almost in a weird sense helps ground me, even though you don't think of this concept as very grounding, because it's like almost directly observing the creator in a certain sense, but it's maybe not grounding, it's very centering, right? Because it's almost like you're centering yourself within the creator, and it's like you're unshakable at that point, right? Whatever the catalyst might be. So another thing that kind of occurs, I think, with certain practices, and once you've meditated a certain amount of time, is you can start to observe energy flows within your own body during catalyst, or during meditation where you revisit catalyst. And once you kind of develop that sensitivity, you can actually use it to kind of self-diagnose perhaps what rays are involved in particular distortions. I think everyone observes energy in different waves. That's a typo. Different ways. I feel it in terms of like water, electricity descriptors. I personally almost never see colors. I mean, I do see colors when I close my eyes, but it's just like spiraling colors. It doesn't seem to be related to like what's going through my body, if that makes sense. Certainly, I think we've all discussed cows with a friend, and how effective that is in helping us balance things. It's probably just a basic part of human nature, or the fact that we're social. And I think Ra talks about the idea that we're almost designed to interact with one another and not just live by ourselves. That's why the Working Group 101s rock. Once again, thank you, Jeremy. You've been invaluable, at least for my journey, so I really appreciate that. So I would term another form of a balancing technique is requesting spiritual aid. You can request spiritual aid from the higher self, creator, spirit guides, social memory complexes, prayer, invocation, dream work. Honestly, dream work is a whole nother extensive category. I'm not an expert. Probably we can have a whole nother presentation on that, so I'm not going to get too much into it for now. I found in my journey requesting aid in the form of like self-healing or wisdom or some sort of internal alchemy is more effective than asking for an external situation. I've also found in my life, for my incarnative life lessons, requesting aid doesn't really do much other than get me a sign that they're very supportive of me. It's almost like you have to kind of, there's some lessons where for whatever reason you have to learn it yourself. It really seems that way. Maybe because you wanted to and you decided beforehand you didn't want much help on it before coming into this incarnation, or maybe it just that's important that you learn in a very deep way. Or I don't know. There's probably some subtleties that we'll figure out in time, space, or something on this. But it seems like you get less help on the issues that you had prior to incarnation for whatever reason. One thing I was particularly upset about, I remember this, is I remember this is like 9 years ago, and I asked for help though. One of my like major life lessons that I knew I incarnated here to figure out, and I think I asked my spirit guides or something, or social memory complex in a dream. Basically, I wanted the help, and I wanted to be helped through a dream. And I remember in the dream, it was just like they're just like showering me with petals, but I could tell it was kind of like you got to figure this stuff out on your own. I was kind of like upset with that a little bit, but at least it was nice. They gave me something, right? All right. So full balancing often requires awareness of the web of interconnected distortions. This is kind of what I talked about earlier about doing your homework. You can't skip from one distortion to the ideal belief. So for example, I'm not worthy of love because I'm not a hard worker. This is just something I just used because it was something that I had earlier in life. So maybe that's the distortion, and maybe you recognize the orange ray belief is I'm unconditionally worthy and unconditionally loved. But the thing is that even though the catalyst might be about one specific issue, like your parents are disappointed in you, whatever, because you didn't get great grades, and so because you're not a hard worker, and so you're not lovable. Often there's a web of interconnected concepts, right? So sometimes, unless you kind of dig deep and you kind of figure out, and often this is hard to do with just one session, but unless you dig deep, you might notice that even if you work really hard on being okay with your parents, accepting your parents being disappointed in you, you still feel like you're a bad person, not lovable because you're not a hard worker, right? And that's because there's all these other adjacent beliefs, distortions rather, that reinforce that. Like, I think society often teaches us you're not a good person unless you're a hard worker, right? You're not going to go far in your career unless you're a hard worker. You're not a man unless you're a hard worker, right? And all those tie back into this concept you're not lovable. This is just one example, but often there's many beliefs, many distortions, and sometimes the distortions can be in multiple rays. So it's just something to keep in mind, that it's just there's a lot going on, and it's important to be aware of it. So this is one thing that I term it thanking the loyal opposition. This balancing technique, I'm pretty confident, is not an accurate depiction of objective reality, but it is personally effective. So sometimes you'll notice that you'll have a highly negative thought. Sometimes you'll wonder, is it coming from within me? Is it coming from somewhere else? But it'll clearly be a highly selfish negative thought. And for me, it's almost like regardless of the origin, just acknowledging and thanking that thought, that it's not a part of your path and not useful to you in your journey, and biting it well and having it go its own way. It really moves around energy. And once again, I'm not necessarily sure if because there's a negative entity, putting that thought near me, or maybe there's a part of me that had a highly negative distortion, but it does seem to work on occasion. And I put a raw quote here about, the idea that everything is service, but can you truly serve by like giving up your life to a negative entity, or basically doing something that isn't consistent with your own polarity and who you are as a being. So it's important and useful to observe patterns of catalysts within one's life. And I think this is a funny meme that someone posted on Facebook, where you're like, why? And you're like, oh, that's why, when you figure it out, right? So there is some support in the raw material for this, but I think most of this has come from my own personal observation. But Ra does talk about that, prior to a certain level of awareness in third density for mind, body, spirit complex, the guardians kind of set up incarnative patterns. And there's another question using that same phrase, incarnative pattern, to talk about basically how to alleviate karma. But then it kind of says this is true for any incarnative patterns. At least for me, I've definitely noticed for my lifelong catalysts, or any major catalysts where there's a lot of interconnected web of distortions, there's a pattern. It just keeps coming up and up and up, right? So the idea of this concept that, mind you, on an objective level, everyone calls me a hard worker, but the idea that you're not breaking your back working hard, you're not a good person, that was something that I learned incorrectly early on, right? Because that was one of my dad's beliefs. He was a workaholic. And so that pattern kept coming up in multiple situations where I was like, man, this is really catalytic. And like, do I have to go back to the old ways of like just, forcing myself to work through adrenaline and stuff? So it was a pattern that came up for the past few years. And I'd like to think that it's mostly gone away. But, I don't know. I don't want to jinx it. So building faith by observing dissolution of the personal veil. So the more and more you meditate, you'll start to bring in meditative techniques automatically into your waking life, as long as you're doing the other work, right? Asking yourself daily, like, was I looking at love in the moment? What was the catalyst of my day? Was I seeing other people as a creator? It seems to automatically quiet your mind outside of meditation. And then you'll notice intuitive thoughts coming up. I would say explore these intuitions, but don't suppress your doubt about them. If doubt falls away occasionally, let it fall away. But I think don't prematurely suppress your doubt ever. Let yourself hold contradictory kind of thoughts and beliefs on it, and explore them. And then, at least when I've done that, I've had moments of the veil breaking where it's like I had an intuition something was going to happen, and I was like, this doesn't really make sense, but I'll take 2 seconds out of my day just to explore it a little bit more, and then it just happens, and it's just like it's not related to anything like super important, but it's just like the chances of that of whatever happened statistically happening just randomly is like 1 in 10,000, and you just feel the best way to describe it, you just feel your personal veil breaking down, and it almost like the beauty of reality overwhelms you, or at least it did for me, and it really overwhelms your green ray, and certainly builds faith. So I think there's blue and indigo as well. And then I think once you're kind of comfortable with the idea of your personal veil dissolving, you can start to interpret your life events symbolically, akin to dream work. And when I say life events, it doesn't even have to be like major life events, certainly major life events, but even medium level life events. And this can definitely yield work. It seems, once again, it seems that perhaps once the veil starts to break down, you notice the mirroring effect between your internal state and external reality, or much more quickly. I don't know, but it seems like interpreting your life or what happens externally as you would a dream becomes much more effective. By the way, we're almost to the end. So surprisingly, we're not bad on time. Okay. So I included this just because I know a lot of people in my family who have a distortion of powerlessness and victimhood. I think they're interrelated. So the one that comes up very commonly in my family is belief that they cannot evolve spiritually without the aid of an external guru. Like they're completely powerless to do anything. And in a certain sense, it's almost related to a victimhood mentality. And I would term the victimhood mentality as powerlessness while also blaming catalyst on an external cause, and believing that the catalyst will only go away when that external cause, person, group changes or is forced to change. Now, once again, the idea that everything's internal shouldn't mean that you turn into a completely horrible person and don't care about social issues. Ra talks about if people are starving, the important thing to do is to feed them, but it's this understanding of I guess the mirroring effect about the internal and external are related. So anyway, I just wanted to mention it because I see it come up a lot, even in like New Age circles, about this idea that you have to like do stuff through an external guru. So this is one of the more advanced technique that I was talking about earlier, surrendering intention motion to the one infinite creator. I don't fully understand this technique. I've used it a few times, the first time being like 10 months ago. And it wasn't, a lot of these techniques, it's not like some of them I've read somewhere, right, in the raw material. But most of these, they just spontaneously occur. And then I'm like, oh, wow, that was really effective. And so this seems to work best when you're at the end of the road and you've tried everything else, because it involves feeling great despair. Well, it involves feeling your distortion, and then the great despair as a result of feeling powerless to change that distortion. And then you also feel great compassion for the fact that you're going through this experience. And it's kind of like completely surrendering to the creator, that entire experience. So I think the first time I did it was like extending my arms, looking upward. I was really emotional at the time. All right. So just to let you know. So extending my arms, looking upward and offering my personal suffering as purely as possible for the experience of the one infinite creator, to be the most perfect vessel in that moment for that suffering. And it was amazing. Like it just completely, vast amounts of energy moving through my green, blue, and indigo ray. And it, in some ways, I would say tore open my personal veil. Yeah, like a communication with my spirit guides, which I guess was never really a goal of mine, just became like almost like automatic to a certain level in meditation and stuff. Since then, I've used it on a few other occasions. It is an interesting technique that I'm looking forward to exploring more. This one I just put in here because it's something that I'm recently started exploring. So this idea of love-based willpower or discipline versus control-based willpower or discipline, for a long time, I was just like really caught up on how do you truly practice willpower and discipline from the positive polarity? Because I think we're so used to using it from a control, should, or fear-based perspective. And at least for me, it was, I guess the way it worked is I just started motivating myself through curiosity to like, hey, let me try this out. And I think I talked to Jeremy about this. Let me just cut out, so Ra talks about fasting, and I think water fasting specifically as an effective way to kind of promote personal change and to use that as a form of balancing technique. The problem for me was I had done water fasting before becoming spiritual. So I think for me, it didn't work because I was just like, it was just, water fasting was just associated with different things. But I was like, let me try out a different form of like willpower and discipline in order to give up something and see how I can use that for balancing. So I guess it's been a while. I think more than a week now. I gave up like sugar. This is really dumb, right? I gave up like something small, sugar, all artificial sweeteners. And it wasn't like the most profound breakthrough, but I noticed that I would use sugar often to avoid the catalyst of boredom, right? If I'm bored, I just like, get like a diet drink or a sugary drink. And the fact that seemed to work, and I tried this whole experiment out, not from a should perspective, but more from a curiosity perspective. And once I did that, it was like something clicked about like I could use this willpower and discipline from a perspective of love and curiosity, as opposed to, oh, I should do this. It's more like you're just exploring and seeing what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at the end here. Parting thoughts. I think a lot of people who maybe are not that spiritual or just starting off spirituality, they expect that spiritual people are just like saints in the moment. And I actually completely disagree. I don't think sainthood in the moment is a measure of spirituality at all. In fact, I think a lot of people artificially suppress their emotions in the moment and stay calm from an egoic perspective to make it seem like they're very spiritual. And look, I'm not saying you should be a total ass and just like yell at people when you're having catalysts. But I think what's more important is to understand how you're going to use that catalytic experience to learn from it and bounce back from it. And so that when that catalyst comes up again, you won't feel those emotions, right? Or you'll, instead of feeling those distortions, you'll feel the balanced form of whatever is going on. I think it's very important because I get into conversations with my family all the time because, they're exploring spirituality and they'll be like, oh, I got anger and I just reminded myself that I shouldn't show anger. I'm like, that's kind of it, but it's more important to revisit why you got angry in meditation, right? And explore the true causes of that so that you won't keep saying, I need to get better about not snapping at people. No, well, maybe explore what's bringing up the snapping in the first place, right? Instead of just saying, I got to control myself, right? It's that acceptance versus control concept that Ra talks about. And I guess let me just end it on by saying, keep in mind the value of technique. It's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the heart of evolution and the idea that we're all one. So now that I went through all of this long presentation, you can just go home with the final understanding that this is really not important and all is one. That's all you really have to remember. No, but it does go on to say that basically, balancing techniques can be useful. But, at the end of the day, it is important to kind of not be too mind-oriented about this. I know that this is very mental and logical in the way we describe a lot of these things, even as we talk about emotions, but it's really about I would say just feeling the love of the creator in the moment. It's the most wonderful thing, and is really my motivating force for going through all of this and discovering who I am and becoming, I guess, in a certain sense, the best version of who I can be here on Earth. All right, and with that, I'd love to discuss or answer any questions.
Thank you. It's very inspiring.
That was fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. Super helpful. Your personal experiences, especially, really, really appreciate you. Making yourself vulnerable, sharing these experiences. They resonate a lot, and I really appreciate it.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. I got to run. I just want to say that it's such a good reminder of some of the practices that somehow got lost in my daily life, and now I can pick them back up. And I really like what you said about how the moment to see the moment to see the love in every moment, and how that is such a spiritual orgasmic energy that's somehow just in the background all the time, and now we just need to take the time to experience it. Like, I know that, but I always forget about it. Yeah,
And interestingly, love takes many forms, including hatred. And sometimes you have to start with the negative manifestation in order to find your way to the pure pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. So the love in every moment, Carly used to cite that theory quite frequently, and she would resort to it, but I often saw the pain on her face as she was trying to do it. So it's not an easy task. It's not all, how does the expression go? Unicorns and rainbows. But I think it's probably the best single meditation technique you can use if it's available. Although, remember that example that Don gives about the bull, the charging bull. It's hard to find love in the moment when you've got to get out of the way of the charging bull.
Very true.
Sometimes there are charging bulls around.
Cool.
One thing that struck me about a lot of the techniques that you talked about is that they all seem to revolve around, as I struggle with catalysts, this seems to be what it breaks down to in a lot of terms. They all seem to revolve around practicing feeling things that you might otherwise try to avoid. And it makes a lot of sense, because to the extent that life gives you a full spectrum of experiences from comfortable to uncomfortable, challenging to easy, your ability to engage in with life and the lessons of life come down to your sheer ability and willingness to feel the things that it's going to provoke. And I find that a lot of times when I shrink from life, shrink from events, what I'm shrinking from is the way they make me feel. It isn't even the thing out there. It's just the conditioned feeling that I have. Were I to just do like one of your techniques, truly put myself in the situation, think about the consequences of being in that situation, and emotionally expose myself to it, maybe I would still be freaked out, but there's a really good chance that I would find the feeling acceptable in some way once I actually engage with it. I'm sure that's not for every feeling, but I have found more and more when I honestly just open my heart to it, and even if it's bad, that I learned something about myself in it that makes it worthwhile, even if it was painful. I guess that's a good way of saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I look forward to seeing everyone. I think we're doing this once a month, or at least meeting.